In this section, you will learn about the trim air system and its controls. You will also learn how to modify cabin zone temperatures. The cockpit and the forward, mid, and aft passenger cabin are the 4 temperature control zones. The zone commanded to the lowest temperature by the temperature control selectors determines the pack air outlet temperature. In this case, the cockpit is determining the pack outlet temperature. The trim air system supplies the required amount of hot bleed air from the pneumatic system to adjust the temperature of the other zones. The individual zone trim air valves automatically meter the correct amount of trim air required by the associated zone to maintain the selected temperature. Just downstream from each pack valve, some of the hot pneumatic air is tapped into a common duct controlled by the trim air valve. Now touch the trim air switch to position it to off. Correct. With the trim air switch positioned to off, the trim air valve closes and the trim air switch off light comes on. ICAS advisory messages appear and the zone compartment temperature in-off lights come on. With the trim air valve closed, the zone temperature controls are deactivated and both packs operate to maintain a 24 degrees Celsius or 75 degree Fahrenheit temperature in all the temperature zones. Now touch the trim air switch to position it to on. Correct. With the trim air switch positioned to on, the trim air valve opens and hot air is routed to the zone temperature ducts. The trim air switch on light comes on. The zone temperature in-off lights go off and the ICAS advisory messages disappear. The zone trim air valves meter air to mix with the cool air from the packs when this is required to meet temperature commanded by the temperature control selectors. Temperature control selectors control the temperature of the air supplied to the temperature zones. When the temperature control selector is positioned in the auto range, the selected temperature is maintained automatically by the system. The range, which can be selected, varies from 18 degrees Celsius at the cool position to 30 degrees Celsius at the warm position. The normal selector position at cruise altitudes to provide comfortable cabin temperatures is in the 12 o'clock to 1 o'clock range. Now touch the forward cabin temperature control selector to position it to a cooler setting. Correct. The forward cabin temperature control selector now determines the pack outlet temperature, since it is positioned to the lowest temperature setting of the 3 temperature control selectors. The pack outlet air temperature is reduced in both packs since they are both operating, and the pack selectors are positioned to auto. The forward passenger cabin zone trim air valve closes, and the cockpit trim air valve opens to add trim air to match the temperature commanded by the cockpit temperature control selector. Now touch the aft cabin temperature control selector to position it to off. Correct. With the aft cabin temperature control selector positioned to off, the aft cabin zone trim air valve closes. The associated zone in-off light comes on, and an ICAS advisory message appears. The associated temperature zone loses its controlling input to the pack outlet air temperature. The in-off light and associated ICAS advisory message also come on anytime an overheat or fault is detected in the associated zone temperature control system. The flight deck temperature control selector on the 767 has a manual position instead of the off position on the cabin zone selectors. The manual position allows the pilots to manually set the position of the cockpit zone trim air valve. The flight deck trim air valve position indicator displays the position of the cockpit trim air valve from closed to full open. The indicator shows a range from closed, which is labeled cool, to open, which is labeled warm. Touch the flight deck temperature control selector. Correct. With the flight deck temperature control selector positioned to manual, the cockpit loses its controlling input to the pack output temperature controller. Holding the selector to manual warm opens the zone trim air valve more to increase cockpit temperature. Holding the selector to manual cool closes the valve more to decrease cockpit temperature. You have completed this section. Touch Advance to continue to the next section.